right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending. This is going to be really, really special. We're really honored. Next up, we have a conversation that I hope you guys are going to look forward to as much as I have. We have Mark Uyeda, who served on the Commission of the United States Exchange Commission since 2022. His focus includes market structure, investment management, and regulatory policy. I think it's safe to say that he's an expert in a lot of the things RIAs are interested in. And also returning to the stage is former SEC Commissioner and current Robinhood Chief Legal Compliance and Corporate Affairs Officer, Dan Gallagher. Please welcome them to the stage.
Well, I'm back. You guys thought you got rid of me. And I'm scripted, too, because they're nervous, and they don't want me to get crossways with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which I've done before.
And that was while you were on the inside.
Yeah, that's while I was there. Imagine being on the outside. So, like yesterday with Professor Brummer, and even more so with Mark, it's a real honor to sit here with a good friend, first and foremost. Mark and I have known each other for about 20 years. And to set the stage for this, there's a really cool picture of Commissioner Paul Atkins, now chairman, and his three counsel, Mark Uyeda, Hester Peirce, and Dan Gallagher, standing behind. And it's hanging on the wall at the SEC. We all have our own copies of it. And we're destined to recreate it, but I need to lose about 20 pounds first, because Mark and Hester look exactly the same. And so does Paul, by the way, which is amazing. He's timeless. But thank you so much, Commissioner, for being here. We know how busy you are. This is a really important conference for Robinhood and TradePMR. These are the lifeblood of this business. Our advisors, our friends, folks that work with us on a day-to-day basis. I think the story here. Here's TradePMR, this hugely successful business. An upstart, a disruptor in its own way, right? Trying to disrupt the provision of services to RIAs, a new platform. So it meshes really well with Robinhood, right? The disruptor in the brokerage space. Now we're paired together, and we've just been having a great time with the TradePMR team as part of Robinhood. I don't even think of them as TradePMR anymore. They're the Robinhood team down in Florida, or part of the larger Robinhood team in Florida. So this is the annual conference, and we usually have a really good time. I'll try to stay on script, but I know before we get going, you have some words for us here.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for the opportunity to be here. And give me the opportunity to share some views, which represent my views as an individual commissioner, not necessarily the views of the full commission or my fellow commissioners, but also just an opportunity to talk to so many RIAs. Which one of the things that we do, you did, I know back when you were at the SEC, I do, is we talk to individual retail investors. And a lot of them will say, I'm educated, I've gone to college, I've done postgraduate work, but you know what? I just am not that interested in personal finance. But I know it is crucial if I am going to set myself up for long-term retirement success, success for my children who want to go to college, other financial stability. But just like if you own your own home, you don't need to be your own electrician and your plumber. You want to hire a professional. And I think we collectively in the United States, as an RIA, have a very comprehensive set of rules to at least mitigate the risks that you are going to get that bad plumber, or you are going to get that bad electrician, you are going to get bad or conflicted financial advice. But so many American households really count on all of you to help them deliver on their financial goals and objectives.
Yeah, and we're very, very fortunate to have your perspective. Rob alluded to it, and I'll get it wrong if I tried to trace your whole professional bio, but Mark knows what he's talking about. He's been in or around the advisor industry his whole career, private practice, state government, the SEC for a long time, including the Division of Investment Management, Department of Labor, very important for this crew at some crucial times during the first Trump administration. and now as commissioner, where you see just about everything. So, excited to get your perspectives. And with that, I'm going to tee it off with one sort of high-level question. So you have, folks who are either RIAs, dual hats, but with a real focus on the advisory industry. What are the sort of top priorities you see that are relevant to this crowd coming out of the commission, maybe DOL, other regulators?
Yeah. Well, three main priorities for the commission, which is what our chairman, Paul Atkins, has expressed. Crypto, we need to have a rational regulatory system for crypto, including dividing what is within the SEC's jurisdiction and what is in the CFTC's and what may fall elsewhere. Second, more public companies or making IPOs great again. I think it's been tremendously exciting. You've obviously read the news. We have a number of large IPOs coming out. We have many more in the pipeline. I think actually what's been most exciting is just under the new administration, we've encouraged public companies to go public. The last administration, not only did we have a whole set of rules and proposals out there that were going to make your life as a public company executive much more difficult, much more seem like a lose-lose proposition that no matter what you do, you will somehow get tagged with a violation, and if not from the SEC, from a state attorney general or from the plaintiff's bar, why go public? And the worst of it was, had the election in 2024 gone a different way, you would have seen even more prescriptive proposals that would face. And so just that whole, it was like an anvil hanging over their head as to, well, what would drop next? So anyway, that's the second thing. Get more public companies out there, make IPOs great again. And the third thing is, in order to have that IPO pipeline, we need to have a really vibrant private markets. That's where all these companies and ideas get incubated. But right now, that is purely the province of institutional investors who invest through VC funds and other private vehicles. And if you're a retail investor, you get shut out from that early stage of growth. And wouldn't you want to have a diversified portfolio where you do have some exposure to that area? So what we want to do is make sure that retail investors have the ability to get some exposure to those types of investments during the growth early stage, as opposed to just post-IPO.
That's great. And I guess both, so let's take two of those three. Let's take crypto and private. So if I'm here, I'm an RIA. I was mingling with a lot of these folks last year at the cocktail party, and on crypto in particular, I probably got more questions on crypto. What's going to happen? Because I think for the advisory industry generally, crypto was sort of the forbidden fruit. You weren't going to put it in someone's account if you wanted to. You had a lot of barriers to it. Those barriers are starting to fall, right? And so, but with their fiduciary hat on, you've got the potential to put crypto in accounts. You've got, I'm sure, some customer demand. We talked a little bit yesterday about how it's the younger generations that want some of these more interesting, either crypto or crypto-related products. They're using AI and the like. But I think even older investors are interested in Bitcoin. They're interested in some crypto exposure. And then relatedly, with the private, same thing. It was the forbidden fruit unless you're dealing with an accredited investor. It's going to become more and more ubiquitous. How do you view that increased product offering through the lens of the fiduciary duty?
Yeah. Well, most importantly, I look at fiduciary duty as a process. It doesn't mean you get certain designated outcomes. This product's okay, this product is not. Fiduciary duty, you've got duty of care, you've got a duty of loyalty, or basically either mitigating or eliminating conflicts. You have a duty of disclosure to inform your client as to what you're doing, and a duty to monitor. So all those things are part of a process, both on the SEC and the advisor side, but then also separately, DOL has their own duty of prudence and fiduciary obligations under ERISA. And so it depends on whether or not you're an RIA who's also advising ERISA assets, or you're purely in the non-ERISA space. But let's just stick with the SEC, the Advisors Act. Part of this is exercising that duty of care, knowing what is being offered. I mean, again, going to what I said earlier, you are the professional. The client is trusting you in your professional judgment, but part of it also gets shaped early on about, well, what is the risk tolerance of that? What is the investment horizon? What are the liquidity needs of that client? Again, oftentimes those are all typically taken in at the start of the relationship and then periodically reviewed. Are these still the investment goals and objectives? And then to try and find products that satisfy that. And it should not be for the government. This is something that I saw as a state securities regulator. Some of the states have merit standards, so they'll actually rule this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. A favorite story is you go back to 1980.
Massachusetts.
Right? Massachusetts. And Texas as well.
Texas.
For Apple Computer. Yeah. Massachusetts actually issued a ruling that said, we don't view this as suitable for sale to residents of Massachusetts for Apple's IPO, because back then, for at least an Apple, a company at Apple stage, the states had a role in that. Apple did not even bother to apply for registration in Texas because they were essentially told, you're not getting through. So don't even try. I think things have now, at least within those jurisdictions, have probably changed a bit. I think Texas these days would welcome offerings of new venture stage companies. But ultimately, going back to fiduciary duty, it's a process. It should be up to you using your professional judgment and exercising those duties as to what is appropriate, what is not, and in what levels. You could have the most high risk, futures on real property on Mars, but as part of a diversified portfolio, if it's just a small part, who is it the government to say no, that shouldn't happen? The right amount is zero.
It's so funny, the Apple story, especially when you're on the other end of Massachusetts, and which we've been at Robinhood on occasion, and they lecture you about what's a good product and what's not. It is a very nanny state. Sorry for anyone from Massachusetts. You can always move. Rob has a good realtor for you in St. Pete. But funny enough, I don't know if you know this bit of trivia too, because I always love the Massachusetts piece. I didn't know Texas, so I learned something sitting here. They got a second bite at the apple. Sorry, horrible pun. In the late 90s, when Apple was going through some tough times as a company, I still remember CalPERS declaring, we will not buy Apple. They have horrible corporate governance. And there's been some projections about had CalPERS invested in Apple in '99, I think the stock was trading at like $1. What that would have done to the unfunded pension obligations in California would have been huge. So,
what also shows you what I think, if you set up some very, very strict, this is okay, this is not okay. California, CalPERS also, early 2000s said, we will not invest in anything related to tobacco. And there were some companies that were, of course, a amalgamation of consumer food products and tobacco. So those were put out. Right. Energy. Right. There were a number of institutional investors who were not going to invest in energy, particularly on some of the state and local pension funds. And then you realize, all right, taking those completely off the list has now resulted in significant underperformance relative to the other market. And what's important, at least in the pension area, is that money then comes out of the taxpayers. So essentially, you have folks taking who have their own fiduciary duties under a state and local pension law, making these decisions. But then, what are the consequences for the taxpayers, but also for the employees who depend on that for their retirement and livelihood?
Yeah, so for folks sitting here, right, you're in Washington, you're hearing about a lot of these regulatory changes. We teed up yesterday when I was talking to Professor Brummer that one thing that I've seen and now you're living and have lived which is the sort of cyclicality of regulation, right? We saw with your friend Gary came in and decided not to enforce the proxy advisory rules that the commission had worked on back in 2021. Paul, obviously, as chairman, is rethinking a lot of things that Gary did. I think the climate rule, congratulations, rescinding, I guess is the right word, the climate rule that Gary put through has happened. And so if I'm here, I'm an RIA, and I'm now able to put crypto assets into portfolios, if I'm able to entertain a broader range of privates, do I have to worry that a new administration comes in 3 years and has the exact opposite view, and I have to either divest or, Lord knows, I'm in the crosshairs of some regulatory inquiry? Do you have that same feeling that I have, that you do need to factor that in sometimes?
Yeah, unfortunately, those things can't happen, but I have been more frustrated by how things have been characterized as this significant regulatory whiplash. The whiplash was caused solely by the actions of the last administration. On climate, we already had guidance out there which said you need to think about climate if it is material to your company, if it is material to risk factors, if it's material to your description of the business, capital expenditures, management's discussion and analysis, or material impacting your financial statements. Long-standing, based in case law, and we put out an interpretation, a commission interpretation, 2010, during President Obama's tenure, under Chair Mary Shapiro. Nobody argued with that. I don't argue with that. I don't think most security lawyers argue that if it is material, that you have an obligation to talk about that in your financial disclosures. And all of a sudden, in the last administration, we come in and financial statement disclosure, a 1% effect on any item. That was what was proposed. Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, lots of other qualitative disclosures. All this, that was a radical change from what I think of, regardless of whether you sit on one side of the aisle or the other side of the aisle when it comes to financial regulation, what we have thought is the right role for the securities regulator. And the answer in many cases was, why should we be doing this? Well, we can. The law says that we can adopt any public disclosure requirements if in the public interest and for the protection of the investors. And essentially, it was viewed as that means anything I want, meaning whoever is in charge of the agency can put that out for a rulemaking. I disagreed with that. Mm-hmm. That is really what I think our climate change rescission talks about, which is it can't be that Congress gave us unlimited statutory power to require whatever disclosures we want about anything. One can even imagine the most minute detail on that about your company or the executive team. And again, I think there's a limit on the securities laws.
Well, it would make, you could take the logic to its furthest extent and say the SEC is the regulator of every industry, domestically and quite frankly abroad, because of the global conglomerates that are listed companies in the U.S. And some people want to take that view.
Well, and Scope 3 on the climate proposal would have given us jurisdiction over every single company that is in the supply chain, upstream of a public company or downstream for their customers and how they're using it. And I just can't
explain that for 1 second. So I don't know if the folks are following. So there was an audit requirement or something of
yes.
An audit?
So scope 3 levels, and I will just high level. Scope 1 is what the public company, their emissions in direct result of their operations. Scope 2 is the emissions from energy suppliers to that public company, and Scope 3 is the emissions associated with both the upstream and downstream of the products and services from that company. So that means, imagine you're a big, this is what really, I think we got a lot of comments when we adopted the final rule, which ultimately ended up dropping Scope 3. Now, on the one hand, it would have been tremendously expensive to do because imagine you're a food company and you buy from, let's say, a food wholesaler who then buys from a regional wholesaler, ultimately going down to the family farm that produces grains or whatever. You'd have to measure every step of that. Now some have said scope 3 is the vast amount of emissions. But we didn't bother to repropose climate change. We just said, all right, we'll just drop scope 3. But even scope 1 and 2, what was left was very, very costly, and it's since it raised a lot of questions. And this was the point of the litigation as to whether or not we had the authority and whether we actually had a reasonable grounds to support that, our thinking on that.
Yeah. God, you're taking me back. So when I was on the commission, it was right after Dodd-Frank was put in place. And in case you guys didn't know, Dodd-Frank was supposed to be the congressional response to the financial crisis. Now, it was a single-party piece of legislation. I think there was one Republican vote. It was Scott Brown from Massachusetts, I'll point out. And it was supposed to be about the financial crisis. I was at the commission during the financial crisis. You were at the commission during the financial crisis. I was at Lehman Brothers, funny enough. But I didn't worry when I was at Lehman about conflict minerals from the Congo. But that was included in Dodd-Frank, a disclosure requirement for public companies to disclose the use of conflict minerals from the Congo. And it had something very similar to what you were just talking about, as you remember, an audit requirement for every part in your manufacturing process. And it was one of the best meetings I had as a commissioner. The CEO of Boeing came in to me. And this is where I talked yesterday about how it's just really important to have your voice be heard, to advocate as a single firm. As an industry is important, but as a single firm. Here's a great example. The CEO of Boeing comes in. He's a very busy man, but he has to come to the SEC, make all the rounds with the commissioners. And he says to me, Commissioner, we're building this 787, right? It was still kind of new at the point. And it has, I forget the numbers, 790 million parts in it. And he had this schematic he was showing me. And he's like, now whether one of the washers came from a supplier that was, and I was like, oh my God, this is unbelievable to me that this was actually put in legislation. So luckily that rule has gone nowhere too, but I think this all traces back.
Well, it's still out there.
Still out there as a requirement, but not a disclosure.
And there's like a 3-step process. The assurance process is not there, but the mere fact that it's out there on the books has caused a lot of companies to simply say, we're going to boycott anything coming out. It's not only the DRC, but it's any country adjacent to the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Yeah.
And that's actually caused a complete, or at least a significant vacuum and pullout of U.S. Companies in that area.
There's a Washington Post story about it when I was still in the commission. They called it La Loi Obama in the Congo because all the reputable companies left and less reputable countries moved in. It was a shame. Yeah. And unintended consequences, well-intended, but unintended.
A couple countries out in the world that don't have this provision that are more than happy to swoop in there.
The oil and gas one was even
worse. That, but also a lot of critical minerals that go into components that are very much needed for instance, to power the technological revolution.
So this relates, I'll bring it back, relates to your third piece of priorities, which is the public company piece. And I think it's awesome what you guys have been doing. The Make IPOs Great Again kickoff at the New York Stock Exchange. Our CEO went to that. It was a highlight, I think, for him. And you see a lot of naysayers, though, come out and say, there's only so much the SEC can do, right? These are market forces. They'll point to, yeah, there are less public companies, but the market cap is bigger relatively than they was 30 years ago. What's your sense? I mean, are there enough things that are under your control that can incentivize companies going public? Or is it, like, to me, I think you already hit the litigation climate is probably the biggest thing, and there's only so much you can do with that. But are you guys feeling confident that you can really seize on the momentum you have with some of these big, SpaceX and Anthropic and OpenAI?
I think our goal is to take things off at the margins on 2 fronts. One is the costs and the downsides being a public company, but the other is the benefits. And for instance, our proposal on registered offering reform talks about, hey, should we expand the ability to do secondary offerings? when I was in private practice, if you're for a small or mid-sized company, you didn't meet that S3 eligibility threshold, so you'd end up doing a PIPE. Private investment, public equity, you put up a resale registration statement, kind of gets you to the same result. You're going to issue publicly tradable securities, but first you got to go through a private investor, take a discount on that capital raise for the lack of liquidity until the resale registration statement gets up. Now here we are. I mean, that was back in the 90s. The rules really haven't changed significantly since then. The last time we probably looked at S3 was maybe a quarter century ago or so, or 20 years, 25 years. If you could say the information environment has changed. Everyone has access to all the documents that are filed with the SEC. Why not open up? I mean, that's our proposal. And now if you're a CEO, you can be thinking, hey, this could be advantageous because if I do need to raise capital, I can do it faster with through the shelf registration without taking that discount that I would have if I do a private placement first. So again, that's on the benefit side. On the cost side, let's go back and take a look at some of the things we've done. I know one of the things, we held some roundtables last year about the pay for performance requirement. Speaking of Dodd-Frank, we'd put it out back in the Obama administration. It sat dormant for 6 or 7 years, and without even doing a reproposal and an updated economic analysis, the last administration just went forward to adopt it, and they made a very important change, which dramatically raised the costs. Anybody can probably, you don't even probably need to pull this in the SEC or Edgar, but you could just pull it automatically. Here's what the comp was, or the comp and our stock price, and here's a broad-based security index. Pretty certain. Right. No, instead they said, we need you to do a Black-Scholes revaluation of all the incentive compensation. It's, again, for what? And if you look at our...
So that we don't have another financial crisis, because it was in Dodd-Frank.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
But it was one of those things where you had a number of academics who said it'd be theoretically more pure if it was this other way. Yeah. But is that how investors are going to actually read it? I mean, do you need, if you tell them just what the value, or at least they know how much incentive comp is already out there. We have extensive, and you probably have to oversee this as the chief legal officers, all of these complicated numbers out there to tell a story.
I'm not good at math, so I rely on a great team.
But my guess is you very rarely ever see questions coming from analysts about, well, let's talk, or even some of the, I'd be surprised when I ask for feedback on what companies are, when they engage with the proxy advisory firms, do people ask and focus on this particular disclosure?
So glad you dished up this segue to me, because I was thinking, as we're talking, that the proxy advisory firms are at the center of so many of these issues that we're talking about, and important to this audience, whether you're a big advisor or small, you'll likely avail yourself of some of the services of the proxy advisory firms. A lot of change, a lot of rhetoric around change, a lot of actual rulemaking changes over the years. Where does this stand now with proxy advisory firms? And if I'm an RIA, what should I know about how I utilize them, consistent with my fiduciary duty? Is that changing because of rule changes?
Yeah. Well, on the SEC side, we are still continuing to think about the role of proxy advisory firms, the control that they may exercise over the recipients. Some recipients of the advice just treat it like a sell-side analyst report. Others pretty much are almost robotic in their following of that. And so when you can command those significant critical mass, let's say 30% of the vote, all of a sudden we have a whole set of rules that say if you control that amount, what sort of disclosure should be provided about your intent and the conversation you're having with management. Unfortunately, our former chairman, Jay Clayton, put together, I thought, a really reasonable package of how to oversee proxy advisory firms, and that was struck down by the DC Circuit. But I was really pleased with what the Department of Labor did on proxy advisory firms. They put out an interpretive release that said, if you are providing this advice to ERISA fiduciaries, that brings you into the definition of a fiduciary, an investment advice fiduciary for purposes of ERISA. Okay. So we have these, again, it's basically a duopoly. I know there are a couple of other smaller entities, but it's really a duopoly.
Right.
That just have so much influence over what's going on, and a real lack of transparency as to how they're getting the conclusions that they are. And also, one has concerns about the quality of the analysis, and I think part of it is
the conflicts.
Oh, the conflicts as well, yeah. But it's also a seasonal business. We have proxy season, so that means just like a retailer. Or certain types of retailers, like toy retailers, they'll do the bulk of their business around December at the end of the year. They have the bulk of theirs kind of in the spring during proxy season. And well, what do they do the rest of the year? So they call in a lot of temporary help just to process all these thousands of companies and tens of thousands of total recommendations on that. And you worry, is it a real box checking exercise, or is it really, we talked earlier about fiduciary duty or duty of care. What are they doing to fulfill their obligations to their clients?
Right.
To issue all this advice in a short period of time.
So if I'm here, I'm an advisor, I'm in the audience, should I be worried if I'm relying on ISS, if I generally do what they say, if I rarely challenge? Should I be worried that the SEC examiners are going to come and question me? Is that an issue that's sort of on the docket for you guys?
I think it should be concerned as to how they're using, like any other third-party provider. What are your sons? I know that was something that the last administration tried through their outsourcing proposal, right. Which I thought was very, very heavy-handed and prescriptive. But that being said, that doesn't mean that just because you retain a third-party provider that say, okay, I don't need to worry about any sort of obligations, or if a third information security is important. One way, books and records requirements, safeguarding your customer assets. The mere fact that you've had a third party say, well, third party did something that resulted in the theft of all my client funds. Not my responsibility.
Yeah.
Things like that. There are still certain types of oversight responsibilities one has on Absolutely. How they use these third-party service providers.
Did I ever tell you my experience, my in-house experience with one of the proxy advisory firms? You guys will love this. I go in-house to a pharmaceutical company. I'll tell you more about that over drinks. And we lose the say on pay vote, which is, it's not binding, but it was historic numbers. It was like 85% against. And of course, both proxy advisory firms had recommended against it. And I just got in there. And I don't think, and if you've beaten me, I don't want to take that away from you, but no one talked more about proxy advisory firms than me during my tenure, and was pretty critical. And they should have known who I was, but someone at this one proxy advisory firm cold called me by email. Hello, Dan Gallagher. We saw this horrific vote, and we think you might benefit from our consulting services. And I looked at it, and I just laughed out loud. I was like, oh, this poor young business development person has no idea what they're doing. So I wrote back and said, indeed, I might benefit, and I would like to meet with you as soon as possible. And I meant it, right? Because the lure had been out there. If you buy their consulting services, you get better recommendations out of the advisory side the next year. And we were all set up like a week later to meet, and it was on Monday morning, and the Sunday night before the poor kid writes me, we've had some issues on our end, and we can't meet for like another month while they prepared to, because someone finally figured out who they were going to meet with. And they walked in, and it looked like an Al-Qaeda terror video. They were quaking, sitting in my conference room. I said, guys, calm down. This is actually real. It's like $50,000 a year for the consulting services. And there's some there to it, like there's some interesting data. But I said, I think if I buy it, I'm going to get a better rating next year. And I know you're going to say you don't. And I said, but I think that, because I think there's a major conflict here. So I'm in. We're gonna I was like the least wanted client at this proxy advisory firm. And guess what happened the next year? The vote flipped, 85-4. Now, and this particular product, now I'm not saying that there's a direct line there. Anyway, that's my funny story.
Well, correlation's not necessarily causation, but who knows, right?
Yeah, right. But it's fun to give the speeches about how conflicted they are, and then it's another thing to see it up close and personal. Okay. Before I want to ask you about AI, because I know you think deep thoughts about these types of issues. But before that, just for the compliance folks in the house, you've got some folks are on the business side and compliance, some CCOs. You got, or just the business folks who have the direct line from the CCO. Any advice in this current environment, issues that CCOs should think about? One thing I always worried about on the commission was poor CCOs and their personal liability. Yeah. They're always living in fear of liability. What are your thoughts for them?
Well, I'd say focus on conflicts and custody. I mean, those are perennial. They never go away. In essence, we talked earlier about the elements of fiduciary duty, but if you want the even simpler, and perhaps this is how AI would summarize it, basically don't lie, cheat, or steal from your clients. And the CCOs are the frontline staff to oversee that. And that's one of the, again, my worries is we become too prescriptive and it becomes instead a lot of box checking, right. All of the other things and losing focus on the big picture, which is, all right, are our recommendations matching up with how we, if we say this is how we conduct our investment advice process, are you following that process? If not, that's a problem. And I think that's one of the areas where, at least on the enforcement side, we've seen problems. They put together what was accurate at the time, but business has changed, circumstances change, investor desires change, but you never updated your disclosures about this is our process, or how we handle other types of matters, and so we do look at least I would take the view we want to see CCOs that are engaged in reasonable efforts. The easiest case for our enforcement folks to make is the CCO, the person who had the title of CCO did nothing. And I also understand that in a lot of small shops, it's not possible for there to be a dedicated single CCO. They're oftentimes wearing multiple hats. But it's still, if something bad happens, and that's usually what gets our attention, something bad has happened, and then it turns out the CCO may not have engaged in any type of compliance efforts. Right. You had an investment advisor rep who manipulated the system to steal $2 million of client money. Right. Turns out there was not a single process, or there was, but called for certain checks. They were never carried out. And so when I say, well, where did the system fall apart on that?
Yeah. Well, it's good to know. I mean, I worried for a while in the commission that just the CCOs were easy targets, especially on the advisor side with the compliance rule. Right? If there's any failure at the advisor, that means your policies and procedures were deficient, and therefore the CCO. And too many of those cases. But it's good to know it's a more rational.
Well, that's something that I've constantly questioned our enforcement staff when I see a 20647 charge.
20647.
Why are we charging this? Again, the easiest situation is there, in fact, was no compliance policy and procedure. But it calls for reasonable. You can have perfectly reasonable policies and procedures, and there can still be an underlying
absolutely
problem or incident that merits enforcement, but that doesn't mean that there was a compliance violation.
Right. Okay, AI.
Yeah.
Well, while we have you, we have 6 minutes left. We talked a little bit yesterday, Professor Brummer and I, about AI, and one of the things I'm seeing from the business side, we're a big broker, but we're also, we have our advisor, Steph Guild was just up here, but then we, of course, have our advisor community through TradePMR to worry about. And I see on both the brokerage side and the advisor side a lot of activity happening outside the regulated space that looks a lot like what we do, right? Either providing advice or offering products, right? So what are your thoughts, right? You want, I assume, as an American, for innovation to happen. You want America to be the forefront, and you don't want regulation to stifle it. But at the same time, you have folks sitting here that are intensely regulated, you know, whether it be from the SEC, the states, wherever, and competing in some ways, and it'll become more and more with folks who aren't regulated at all. And that's just one issue within AI, but I'm curious just generally what your thoughts are on AI.
Well, there are so many things, and what you raise is, you know, I think a really interesting question. Probably one of those cutting-edge legal questions is AI essentially providing investment advice?
Right.
And you look at the definition
Right.
of who an investment advisor is and whether or not they fit into any of the carve-outs on that. And you know, if you go in years past, when someone gives out general investment advice, there's the publisher's exception. But that's not very different than what you might be doing on some of these AI models by actually putting a lot of information to get a personalized recommendation of some sort. So I think, you know, that is something that, at least when I think of the legal issues, we should be thinking about to provide the clarity. But then let's take a big step back on AI just in general and how the ability to potentially transform financial services and the provision of investment advice as a tool of an investment advisor. The ability, I mean, we've had all sorts of automated tools for a long time. You know, one can think of, you know, the various order types. If prices hit certain levels, it'll trigger certain actions, which you can say is a very rudimentary form of automation. Now we have much more advanced possibilities, ability to process reams of information far faster than humanly possible, especially, you know, when you think of the old technical analysts and
Right.
things like that.
Right.
But again, those are things, I mean, we've had the algos out there and the high frequency traders out there for quite a long time doing that.
And those were, if you think about like an algo, right, the flash crash and all these things, it's a little more linear though, right? You put in this technology, you know what the inputs are, and then you test the outputs. But it's a little harder these days because both the inputs and the outputs are a little more variable with AI,
Yeah.
right? So that's what.
Well, it's, again, what I think of an evolution, I would say the idea of creating tools to effectively achieve desired outcomes, that's nothing new, right? We've been doing that, I mean, going all the way back to when you change things from message from pigeon carriers to the telegraph, right? We've always tried to progress, and usually I would say also that the progression is not in a straight line. You know, there are ups and downs and mistakes, and we learn from those. I'd like to think that what we've done historically as an agency is not to try and straitjacket a particular business model to a certain period of time and not allow any advancement. We should be having a series of regulations that says, okay, you need to think about how all these advances can advance the state of your business. You know, one of the things I've been critical of the things that we did in the last administration, but one of the things I am at least happy this particular part was we got rid of the requirement to put all your books and records on a CD-ROM.
That's right.
You know, which had been out there since, you know, it was cutting edge technology in the 1990s.
The worm.
But yeah, write once, read many.
Yeah. Right.
And which just the idea that, nope, you can't possibly keep books and records, or at least that was the initial answer on, for instance, cloud computing.
Right, yeah.
You know, we need to have the ability to evolve, but we should be thinking, you know, the whole point is, can you keep your books and records in a way that we can rely that these are the books and records of the business? So when we get, and that's our regulatory oversight purpose on that, and we should be indifferent on the form of technology as long as it gets us the result we want.
Right.
So AI again, going back to our discussion earlier about fiduciary duty, you can't blame mine. It's like to lie, cheat, or steal. It's like, hey, here's a better way to cheat your customers using AI. Just whether you're using AI or not, cheating your customers is still prohibited by our anti-fraud rules.
And is AI sort of a focus across the commission now, the various uses? I mean, because you have AI companies going public, you have AI washing or whatever they call it now, companies claiming in public disclosures to be using AI or benefiting from AI in ways they're not, and then you have the regulated entity stuff. Is each division sort of looking at the impacts on their various silos?
Oh, well, there's that, and then we also have overall group that looks at technology. And say this is beyond the agency. One of the things I do is represent the SEC at the international level for both IOSCO and then occasionally, like I just said earlier this week, at the Financial Stability Board, and AI was definitely a hot topic.
Yeah, definitely. But it also seems it just seems like regulators are scrambling a bit it's just moving so fast, and through no fault of their own. They're humans inherently. They're not AI yet. We don't have AI SEC. God, what a horror! It'd be like a Terminator movie or something. But there's a lot of sort of rush to figure out the technology and then figure out what's the right response to it without stifling it. That's what I feel like, at least in the U.S. in this current administration.
I think that's right. You want to have innovation, but again, innovation cannot overrule, at least, again, the high-level requirement that you don't engage in fraud, market manipulation, insider trading, all of those, a litany of other things that we have prohibited for many, many decades.
Good advice. Good advice from a good public servant. And we've wrapped up our time. I wish we could keep going on. Thank you so much, Commissioner, for being here. Thank you for your public service and personally for your friendship. And it was really awesome to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.